Tomes and Tropes podcast where books and friendships collide. I'm Becca.
And I'm Carrie, and we're two friends who love to talk about books. Today, we are so excited to introduce you to Kyrie McCauley. She is an award-winning YA fantasy author of All the Dead Lie Down, We Can Be Heroes, and If These Wings Could Fly, which won her the William C. Morris Award. She has a new book coming out on June 18th called Bad Graces, and we are so thrilled to have her on the podcast. So welcome, Kyrie, to the Tomes and Tropes podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. So for our listeners who don't know you, could you start with an introduction into you and what's new going on with your life?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Kyrie. I write young adult books. I sold my first book back in 2018, and it was published in March of 2020. So I think I've had a really specific and unique introduction to the writing field, just because so many of my events pivoted to online events. But the great news is we have so many online resources now for writers and for readers. So I've been able to release two more books since then, We Can Be Heroes and All the Dead Lie Down. And I'm so excited for my fourth book, which is coming out on June 18th from HarperCollins.
Woohoo! We're so excited for that.
We are. We got a little tidbit into Bad
did.
Graces, and we're really excited.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm so excited for it to be out of the world.
So how did you get involved in writing, and what led you specifically to YA and YA fantasy genre?
So I think like a lot of writers, it was always reading for me. I was definitely one of those middle schoolers that hid in the library over lunch, and the librarian was my bestie. So from a really young age, books were this huge source of comfort. And I'd put them up so high in my mind on this pedestal that for years and years and years, it was essentially gaslighting myself. I was like, you can't be an author. Only magical people write books, because look at all of the joy and comfort and wonder that it's brought you. So I convinced myself for actual decades that wasn't a thing that people just sat down and did. I thought you had to have some really raw, natural talent that was obvious to everybody. So I didn't pursue it until my early 20s. I was already in my senior year of college, and I was really overwhelmed with writing a thesis and getting through all of those, capstone, all this stuff that was really high pressure. And so on the weekends, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to start writing fiction for me for fun. And it became this hobby. And then it just kind of snowballed until it was the only thing I wanted to do. So I graduated and I worked in my field, and then I went back and got a master's degree in my field and worked a little more. And the whole time I was sneaking and writing whenever I could. It was such a passion project. And then it wasn't until I was home with my second child when he was born that I sort of had a minute away from work. I'd worked a job or two or three since I was 15. So it was the first time I was just in my house. And I was like, I'm actually going to try this for real. And I did NaNoWriMo and challenged myself to just finish a book. And it sort of just blossomed from there. I just kept, now I'm I'll just write as long as they let me. As long as I can keep doing this, I will do it because I love it so much.
What is NaNoWriMo?
That's National Novel Writing Month. So in November, it's a 1 month long writing challenge for aspiring writers, and you're supposed to write 50,000 words in those 30 days.
Oh my
Wow.
It gives you you sign up, and there's community and there are forums, and you get a little tracker, which was really motivating for me to be this was the bar, and you had to match those words every single day. And for me, that was just the amount of motivation I needed to write consistently every single day for a month. So yeah, I won Nano, which is what they call it when you hit your 50,000 words. And then I had a really rough skeleton draft of a first novel. The book was terrible. It didn't go anywhere after that, but it was such an important lesson to be oh my gosh, I can finish writing a book, because before that it had been a lot of false starts. So it gave me a lot of confidence to keep going.
Yeah, and kind of like a trial by fire. You have to hit it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
That's the
Amazing.
motivation I need for the day.
It was really, I never did it again. Like I've done Nano again. I've never hit the 50,000 words in 1 month. It's an unrealistic pace for regular life. But that month I did it and I was like, okay, now I've shown myself it's possible. And once I do that, I'm like, well, I can recreate this under much less stressful circumstances for sure.
Yeah, for sure. What was your first novel? Like which one was first?
It was a young adult fantasy inspired by Irish folklore. So it was about like
Mm.
selkies. It was set in Maine, just like All the Dead Lie Down is. So I definitely like hinted at some of those early story ideas when I was writing my third novel. But yeah, I couldn't say for sure that it had a plot. Um, it thought it did for a minute, and it was also really short, so there wasn't a lot that I got to flesh out in that early draft. But it had a beginning and middle and end and a main character. So as far as NaNoWriMo is
Hey.
concerned, like I hit the goal.
That's all that matters.
Yeah.
So, how did you get drawn to writing YA not instead of, but I guess kind of instead of like
Yeah.
adult or like
Anything else?
children's? Yeah, anything else.
Um, the simple answer is it's my favorite thing to read. So I think that I had already consumed so many YA books, and YA wasn't really a popular thing when I was that age. So when I was 15 and 16, I was reading adult novels. And it wasn't until I was like in my 20s in college where I was like, "Ugh, these books are a little depressing. They're about really adult things. I don't really want this." So, and I'd also had kind of a traumatic childhood. So I think going back to YA and kind of revisiting those years from a million different perspectives was sort of like healing. And it was fun to live in that age again. And yeah, so when I started writing, that was just naturally the voice that came out. And I've just never, I'm interested in writing adult and I'm really interested in writing middle grade because I connected with those books so strongly when I was in middle school. But yeah, for now it's been strictly YA. Everything I sit down, even when I intend for it to be different, just kind of like morphs back into the young adult voice.
So,
Well,
would you
we're
say those are like your favorite types of characters to write?
Yes, there's something about I guess just like the overarching theme of like coming of age that I think is so rich with like first experiences and self-discovery. There's so much there, and every story that I write is really different from the one before, but it keeps coming back to those main ideas. And I'm sure we'll get into this later, but young adult literature is some of my favorite tropes too. So I think that I
Amazing.
kind of just like lean into it, and you can have fun with it and still address like some really important topics. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, I
We'll
love
definitely
it.
be talking about that later. Can you talk about your writing process? Like, how do you find ideas? Like, what helps you stay motivated in writing without having that deadline of
Right.
50,000, 500,000 words or whatever?
Well, I still love a good deadline. Working
Don't
working
we all?
on it's very helpful for me. Free time is like my worst enemy. I need every minute booked so I can stay, productive and on top of stuff. But a lot of my books really do start with like a single compelling image. So it's a flash of something in my mind, and I'm like, wait, that's really interesting. What is that? And then it's just like this process of curiosity and fleshing out those ideas. I tend to write down a list of like scenes that I know I want to build to in my story. I'm not very good at having like a full outline. The one time I did it, I was like bored silly when I started writing the book because I knew everything that happened. And I was like, I can't do this because I don't care. I already know what happened. So I really am such a like discovery writer. Even when I try not to be, I'm like, this time I'm gonna be organized. It doesn't happen, and it's like the chaos has to be part of my writing process in order for me to enjoy it enough to stick with a story and stay motivated to keep working on that story. So I like the surprises and like having my characters kind of lead the way at times. It does mean that I build myself towards messy endings because I didn't have the ending in mind when I started. So a lot of times when I'm doing edits, that's where a lot of my like heavy revising comes into play because it's like, okay, these are great storylines, we have a lot of loose ends. So going back in and making sure I weave them back together. And that's where I love working with an editor because they're so good at being like, hey, you forgot about this whole character over here. Like, oh, wow, right? Whoops. So I love working with somebody and making what is usually a really lonely process like very collaborative and bringing more people into the fold.
I love that. Yeah, I've always thought of writing as like super, like you said, lonely, but having like an editor and having like a team around you is really fun. I'm
It
sure just like
it
building
is.
on ideas and like getting to brainstorm, is this like a good idea? Or I don't
Yeah.
know.
And when you find a good editor to work with or a great agent like I have, it's like you can bounce those ideas back and forth and they'll be like, "Wait, is this what you mean?" And I'm like, "Oh no, that's not what I mean." So it becomes really helpful at different stages of the writing process too, from like that really, really messy first draft to cleaning up those last few edits.
I love that. All right. So this one is really cool because I read If These Wings Could Fly before our
Yeah.
interview, which I really enjoyed. So at what point do you decide like which fantastical elements to use to portray in real life situations of these characters, of their situations that have happened? Like in If Wings Could Fly, you use the crows as a
Yes.
fantastical element to build the tension throughout the story, which I
Yeah.
absolutely loved. So, how did you decide to use them and other fantastical elements in Bad Graces and your other books?
So I think the thing that I really love incorporating into my writing is like surrealism and like fabulism and things that just remove you like one step from reality. So my first two books really do fall into the contemporary category in almost every regard, except for one or two elements that kind of elevate them closer to fantasy or fabulism or something like that. And if these wings could fly, the town is invaded by like a massive murder of crows, like 100,000 crows, and they sort of become the backdrop of the story. What's funny though is the crows actually aren't a fantastical element entirely. Like the crows' behavior in the book is very particular, but this is a
Mm-hmm.
real thing crows do, where they will sort of invade a town and take over like a bunch of murders kind of like converge together until it's this massive amount of birds.
No
Um,
way.
yeah, I found that while I was doing research on the book, and I was like, oh, this is exactly what needs to happen in this town because I found that there was a town in New York where it happened, and they were like, we need to get rid of these birds. They're such a nuisance, and they brought in like noisemakers and birds of prey to scare them, and all of these different strategies to drive the crows away. And then it happened in this town in Pennsylvania, and they were like, we're just gonna embrace it. We're gonna have a crow themed festival every year when they come back. And I just thought that was fascinating that these are two towns that even geographically aren't that far removed from each other, certainly not socially, and they had like exact opposite approaches to a problem. So I'm a writer. I love a good metaphor. So when I was sitting down to work on If These Wings Could Fly, I just thought it was really perfect to talk about as a backdrop to the story, to talk about a societal issue that is right there in front of everybody, but nobody really likes to talk about, and everybody has different approaches to. So the book is about domestic violence. And so when I was working on it, it was really important to me that I made the topic, authentic in its portrayal. I'm a survivor, and I also worked in advocacy for several years. That's what I studied in school, was sociology, and I went into direct services in a domestic violence clinic. So I got to see all of these very real lived experiences of what that looks like. And when I was writing this story, it was really important to me that the actual dynamics of unhealthy relationships was authentic and real. But then I wanted there to be like some space between the reader and those events. So if someone was reading it who was a survivor, they wouldn't necessarily be triggered by what they were reading. And if someone was reading it who had never experienced it before, they could almost read it as if it wasn't something happening next door. And I think in my my view, it just lets you get a little bit closer to the topic without it feeling like too heavy. So yeah, I really like to incorporate like a little bit of magic, just to kind of like ease readers into some of these topics.
Yeah, that as someone who's never been through a domestic violence situation, I thought it like brought the real reality of the situation and seeing that portrayed, and realizing how like close to home it could be and probably is, and
Yeah.
just getting that like education without like it feeling like an education was really just enjoyable in the sense of the story, but like
Right.
also just profound. And I just thought it was really well done. So,
Thank you so much.
yeah.
It was it felt very responsible for the subject matter. So it took me a long time to even figure out like how to approach a story like that about something so serious and still make it accessible for teens.
Yeah. It was very, very well done. Like, I
Thank you.
definitely have already recommended it out to people. Please read this.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, for Bad Graces, without spoiling too much, how did you decide like what fantastical elements to include in that particular story?
Bad Graces was tricky. It was kind of hard because I didn't want to get away from some of the central themes of the story about like survival, and I didn't want to have like any easy outs for the idea of a survivalist story. I wanted it to be just as like harsh and difficult to navigate and be realistic in that sense for what would this situation look like for teenagers? How would they survive this? How would they even approach the idea of surviving something like this? And then for me, the fantastical elements of Bad Graces really came from the themes of the story, and the major one here is like healing from trauma. So there were different ways that I could incorporate that, but for Bad Graces, I wanted it to be, we have their backstories of these six girls before they're stranded on the island and different things that they'd experienced in their life that they maybe hadn't healed from. And then on the island, they're experiencing illness and injury. And as they're recovering from those things, their bodies are physically changing. They're experiencing transformation. So for me, it was this idea that, we suffer all kinds of traumas throughout our life and we can heal from them, and they're going to change us. And that change might be really obvious and on the surface, or it might be buried down deep, and it might be a change for the worse or for the better. And sort of just like, how do you embrace that new version of yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we get too far, we've kind of teased Bad Graces a little bit, but would you mind sharing your elevator pitch of like what Bad Graces is about?
Yeah, so Bad Graces, in short, is about 16s who shipwreck on an abandoned island, but they are not alone. So the story follows our main character, Liv, who is a former foster kid, and she wins a prestigious internship on a film set. So she is en route to that film set with a group of girls around her age who are much more privileged and much more famous than she is. So there's a pair of actress sisters, there's an Olympic gymnast. These girls have very different backgrounds from our main character, Liv. But the six of them end up shipwrecking on an island together. It's abandoned. It was a former military base, they learn, but they're not actually entirely alone because there's a predator on the island with them.
Amazing.
That was a really good pitch.
That was a very good pitch. All right, so as you mentioned, there's like this predator on the island with them. They're having to survive from this shipwreck. And you kind of go into how the girls need to work together to conquer this island and this predator, and their trauma really binds them to the island, but also to each other in a way. So
Yes.
I guess where did you draw from when you were thinking through their survival of this, but also their relationships and how their survival was not only reliant on their relationships, but their relationships were also reliant on this survival?
It was, yeah, absolutely. So there were a lot of stories that I was consuming. Once I knew I wanted to write a book about sort of like being stuck on an island. So there was navigating or being trapped somewhere. I hadn't actually even decided on an island yet, but I was just consuming a lot of media that portrayed these different things. So like Lost and Yellow Jackets and Lord of the Flies, and kind of delving back into all of these different stories that approached something along those lines. But what I was looking for was like, what can I do differently, and what can I say that hasn't been said before about six teenage girls only, like just them. There's nobody else there. So it really comes down to what kind of choices that they would make in this situation. But I didn't want to fall back on the idea of like pettiness. So they don't fight. There's tension, and there are a few like really, I think, meant to be organic arguments that come out while they're on the island. But I really wanted to show that six teenage girls could, in fact, learn to fully trust each other and rely on each other and use all of their different backgrounds and skills and strengths to save each other in a lot of different ways while they're on this island together. So I sort of wanted to just subvert that a little bit, and instead of having it be like, oh, well, the thing that destroys us is the infighting, have it be the exact opposite, where it's really like, okay, we've got each other's backs. Now, how do we approach all of these other dangers and threats that we're facing?
Yeah, I loved how you really, like you said, like their relationship was not strained for a large majority of the book. They really worked together, which was amazing. And I think that goes into like being in society versus like outside of society, right? And being in a new environment where you don't have those norms that you have to stick to. But I thought it was so interesting, like even the island is kind of making its mark on them and their relationship. So can you dig into like how even though they're in a new environment, like you're still having to deal, like it's still making its mark on you, but
Yes.
maybe not the same mark that you thought it was going to.
Yeah, so I think one of the big things for my six girls in this story is that they're all bringing something to the island with them. Like they have these full lives and these full backgrounds. They're like fully fledged people who have dealt with a really critical society for 16 or 17 years, depending on how old they are. And for five of the girls, they've done this in a very real spotlight. So with a lot of public attention on them as a pop singer and as actresses and as an Olympic gymnast and a social media influencer. So they're used to having like all eyes on them, and then all of a sudden there's no eyes on them anymore. It's just who they are. So in a sense, it kind of like forces them to confront themselves. There's a lot of like discovering who you really are without all of that extra stuff tagged on. And also learning that they have things to heal from, things that they might not have even acknowledged off the island, things that are like buried deep down. And when it's just you and a group of friends, but really when it's just you kind of have to confront those things. So each of these girls is undergoing kind of like an emotional growth as well as like the physical one that they're facing trying to survive on this island.
Yeah. Did the changes that you had each girl go through relate to the previous things that they had gone through, or was it not random, but was it just more planned, or was it like intentionally like I'm giving somebody wings because they need to fly?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was really intentional. Maybe one of the more intentional things I've done in my writing. So I had like this, I have a huge dry erase board in my hallway here for like taking notes and stuff like that while I'm drafting a book. It's used by my kids when I'm not drafting a book, but I was like, all of your cartoons have to go like drawings down. And I made this huge chart, and it was like each of the girls, what they'd experienced off the island, like what their background was, what illness or injury they'll have on the island, and what like physical change they could undergo. And then like making sure that all of those elements had like a thread going through them. So, yeah, so that it was something like related back to their experiences off the island. So for my main character, Liv, she'd been in and out of foster homes her whole life, and she has some scars on her arms from a past experience with abuse. So she doesn't really want the others to see it or notice. She's a little bit ashamed of it. So one of her transformations is kind of like healing these scars and then having something grow over them, and her whole arm and hand transforms. So for me, that was part of her like learning to accept her past as part of who she is. And then learning that she can be accepted for exactly who she is and what she looks like no matter what. So it doesn't define her, and kind of figuring out how to accept that about herself.
Yeah, that was beautiful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Such a good message to share. Like, even especially now.
Thank you.
All right, so we did some digging on you, and we saw you did some non-weird and sketchy digging, but we saw you did some advocacy work. And how has that affect how you write trauma, especially for young women characters?
I think it probably comes into play in all of my characters, even the ones that aren't expressing an experience with trauma on the page. I did this work for years and years, and I'm a survivor myself, so I feel like the amount of responsibility towards writing these things authentically and making sure I'm keeping in mind that like not every experience is exactly the same is really important to me. So how can I show maybe the same thing, like dating violence, in different ways throughout my different stories that I tell? It was also really important to me to show that when you have a relationship that isn't healthy, it's not going to look like that 100% of the time. So I think in all of my books, wherever there's a toxic dynamic, it was really important to me to put like good experiences on page too, because I think it can be really misleading when we're consuming media that shows an unhealthy relationship as like bad all the time. So if someone's like watching that media and they're like, well, my relationship isn't that bad, so what I'm experiencing is nothing compared to what I'm seeing in this movie or reading in this book. So, and that's not really the reality. And all of my work in advocacy and my research and the dynamics of unhealthy relationships, domestic violence, dating violence, and really just gendered violence really shows that it's not that clear cut of a dynamic. There are a lot of ups and downs. Violence works in a cycle. So you have like these honeymoon periods where the other person is like really just giving you so much love and attention. I think now we call it like love bombing, but that's essentially the idea, where they're making it impossible for you to go because they love you so much. So when I'm writing these kinds of dynamics, it's really important that I show that full cycle on page, and not just like, oh, I need a villain, so let me just put in this bad relationship here and make them, a fully black villain, instead of showing that there's a lot of gray in those dynamics. Like these things aren't, and those people can also be like the most charming and most delightful and charismatic. So I think when you write toxic relationships as that black and white dynamic, you really do a disservice for readers and viewers and people who are in similar relationships.
Yeah, I thought you did a really great job of that in with their dad in If These Wings Could Fly, like showing the relationship not only with his kids but with the house, and then with the mom, even just like her ups and downs and her love for him, but also her desire to protect her children, and just the ups and downs of how he would go from like extremely aggressive to like very sweet and kind, and but had this whole other personality when he was outside of the home.
Right.
So I thought that was so good, and I
Thank
could definitely
you.
see that how intentional you were in that story.
In advocacy, we learn that most survivors of domestic violence leave their abusers 7 times before they leave for good. So there's a lot of like back and forth. And I think that there's a lot of like, you convince yourself that they're not that bad, or their friend convinces you to try again, or a lot of times it's coming from like the survivor's own family, where they're like, I think you're overreacting. So yeah, I think that kind of dynamic it can be really specific, and there can be like these textbook examples of it. We know that we can define like what this kind of looks like in a general sense, but then when you get into the nitty gritty of a relationship, and nobody else is from outside is in that home watching those things happen, or in that relationship hearing those conversations, so it becomes really easy for someone to sort of be tricked into thinking that they're overreacting.
Yeah.
So, like, how do you marry with all of that work and all of that background of knowing the trauma and you yourself going through that? How do you marry having that YA audience with the graphic language that trauma
Mhm.
victims do experience and are used to that may not make your book YA appropriate, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, I mean, I've never really thought that there's any particular topic that's off limits for YA. And I think part of that for me has just been working with a really great team who understands what I'm trying to say and helping me get there within the confines of young adult literature. Like I've never had really any pushback on the language I've used, and some of it's been really extreme because that's my experience. That's the experience of survivors everywhere is being called terrible names when you're 15 years old by a partner or by a parent or something along those lines. So I remember having this conversation with my editor where I was bringing it up and I was like, is this too much? Like, do I have to reel this back in? He was like, is this realistic? And I was like, yes. He's like, then don't reel it back in. So it was really wonderful that I had a team I was working with that really understood how like important it was to get this on page and make sure people who were reading it understood really what it's like to be in that situation. But for me, it's really about like being truthful without being gratuitous, being forthcoming about this information without being like heavy handed. Teenagers don't need like a lecture. They might just need like to see themselves on page. Like it's a very different thing to relate to a character than to feel like someone's telling you what to do with your life. So
Mm.
my job as a writer is just to figure out how to balance those things in each story I'm telling.
Yeah, that's amazing. So your writing, like as we've been talking about, speaks to intentional messages that you're trying to portray to the readers, portray to us. If you could have your readers get one thing from Bad Graces, what do you hope they would get from it?
I think Bad Graces at its heart is about healing from trauma and what that looks like for different people. I think it's about the fact that that healing can look and feel different for every individual person with their own life experiences. So it's not just what these girls experience on the island, it's everything that they were before they got there too. And all of that kind of lends itself to how they interpret what's happening, their responses to certain situations on the island, and then in the end, what it is that they're willing and able to do to save themselves and to save each other. So really, I think the idea behind the story is that it's okay to recognize that traumas change us. It's okay to like embrace that new version of yourself and find a way forward instead of fixating on it forever or mourning the person that you were, the person that you lost or might never become because of this thing that has reshaped you. So yeah, I think Bad Graces is really about what's the next step and how do I get there?
Mm. I love that. It's so well said. All right, so we have two questions that we like to ask our guests. The first one, it does relate to our name. So,
Okay.
the first one is, what is your favorite trope? To write, to read, all of the above?
I love this question. I haven't thought about this in a really long time, so I did take a minute. But I'm thinking about like books I've really loved to read lately as well as what I've been writing. And I really think right now it's found family. I
Mm,
think that I come back to that a lot in my writing, even when I don't mean to. It kind of just like finds its way into my stories. And yeah, I love consuming books that have it too. I think that it's such an important dynamic for teen readers in particular. I think that there's a lot of like naturally tension and strife that comes about between teens and their families. So it's a really important stage to be like, okay, who are my people outside of my home? What does that look like and how do I navigate that? And how do you navigate it safely? Um, so I think I think it's such an important thing. And yeah, I really love reading it too.
I love that. Now, for the other half of our name, what is your favorite tome? So, your favorite book maybe
This is
we'll
the
start
hardest
with like,
to ask.
I know, if you have like a top three, we'll take a top three because it's impossible to really ask that of either one of us too. So
It's really hard. So, my go-to answer for this question is Ella Enchanted.
Ooh,
And I think it's just
okay.
because I read it at like a really formative age, and it just stuck, and it felt so magical that it was, I think the first time I was like, I wish I could do this. It was like that book for me where I was like, this
Mm,
is amazing. I wish I could put words on the page that made someone feel the way this book made me feel. And I reread it like every year 'cause I love it so much.
I didn't
And
know it
that's
was a
what I
book.
think. Ella Enchanted, yeah. It's so and I reread it every single year. I read it probably I read it when it was released, so I'm definitely like aging myself here, but I was like 12 when it came out, so it was the perfect age for it.
Hmm.
And it's just fun. It's delightful. And when I was saying before, like, I love the idea of trying to write middle grade one day, I think this is the book in my mind because I'm like, it
Okay.
just meant so much to me. I wish I could like give that gift to another 12-year-old sometime. So yeah, I think historically that's probably my favorite. My recent favorite is called If Tomorrow Doesn't Come. It's by an author named Jen St. Jude. It's a young adult. I think it published last year. I got to read an early version of this book because
Ooh.
this is my favorite like delight of being an author is I can message people and be like, hey, can I read your book, please? It sounds really interesting. And most of the time now they'll be like, yeah, sure, here it is. So I get to read books early. So I got to read an earlier version of If Tomorrow Doesn't Come. And it's just beautiful, start to finish. It's a perfect book.
Mm,
I love it and I recommend it all the time.
I love that.
Amazing.
Okay, I have a question about Ella Enchanted because
Okay.
I like love the movie.
Oh my
Like
gosh. You have to read
I
the book. It's so
love the movie.
That's what I was gonna ask. Is the book like is the movie based on the book?
It is, but I'm gonna call it a loose adaptation.
Okay.
It really, it hits the main beats, but the book feels like literature. Like it's very serious. The book is about
Really?
yeah, about because I know this idea of like a girl who is compelled to do anything that is said to her that's a serious thing. And the author really treats it as such in the text. So the movie is delightful. The book is incredible. I feel like they're separate things in my mind because they're so different. But yeah, it's a quick read. It's lovely. It was also like the first book I read that had like a full-fledged romance in it. So I think my 12-year-old heart was just like a flutter and I was like, oh my goodness, what is this? So yeah, I was head over heels for that book.
Those are the
That
best.
It
yeah,
really was.
that movie was formative to
Yeah.
everything I like now.
Yes.
So
Okay, then I highly, highly recommend the book. And it's a
like
really quick read. It's a little tiny middle. I'll reread it every
perfect.
year, and I read it in like an hour or two. I'm so excited. My oldest is 12 now, and I'm like, guess what we're reading this summer? Ellen Enchanted.
Ella Enchanted. I mean, I'm definitely gonna have to go to my library after this and be like, where is it? I
It's
need
so
it.
good.
I had no idea it was a book. It's like
Neither.
life changing.
Please let me know what you think when you read it.
Oh, I will. And then I'm
Okay.
gonna have to watch the movie again. It's been years.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah, we're very familiar with books that are different entities than shows or movies. We've
Yeah.
talked about that a lot.
It's such a thing. And sometimes I like prefer them each for their own thing. Like you can get so much enjoyment out of it just being able to see it as a movie. But yeah, they change. Sometimes they make decisions where I'm like, what? Why would you change that? That was the best part. Like you broke it, put it back.
Yes.
So yeah, but it's interesting now that I'm on the writing side of it, and my books haven't been developed for anything. But watching my friends go through it, it's like authors have usually, unless they're like really, really top sellers, have like very little say in the whole process. So it's kind of like, here's this thing I poured my whole heart into. Like, please be careful, don't break it, and then you just hope for the best. So
They're like, oh, well,
scary thing.
It would be like giving your baby to a stranger.
Yeah, like I need to do some serious background checks before we move any farther. Yeah.
That's so funny.
Well, lastly, thank you so much for coming on our podcast. We've loved conversing with you. It's been such a pleasure.
Oh, yeah.
But where can our listeners find you?
I can be found on Twitter and Instagram at Kyrie McCauley. And they can also contact me on my website, which is kyriemccauley.com. I also have like a pre-order gift campaign going on right now. So if anyone decides to pre-order Bad Graces, they can send me their information and I'll get some goodies to them.
That's super fun.
Yes. Well, again, thank you so much for being on our podcast. Listeners, thank you so much for listening to us today. Bad Graces by Kyrie McCauley is out June 18th. Please make sure to check it out. For us, please make sure to rate and review us wherever you listen. If you're watching on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for any new episodes. And also, the best thing you can do is share us with your friends.
Yep. And for more content, make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Tomes and Tropes Pod. Or if you have thoughts about this episode or this book, email us at tomesandtropespod@gmail.com. So while you're over there on your socials, be sure to give Kyrie a follow and don't forget to check out any of her amazing books available for purchase anywhere you buy your other favorite books.
Thank you so much, Kyrie.
Thank you so much.
This is so lovely. Thank you for having me.